Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Wallsend history story. This week I am covering the story of the fire that took place at Haggies Rope Works in August of 1933. A few years ago I had seen a photo of the area just after the fire had taken place, but I never actually knew anything about it until recently when I was searching for something else and came across a full-page article about it and thought that it was quite an interesting story and worth telling. I hope you will also enjoy it and find it interesting. Obviously, I don't have any photos of the actual fire or any that I can use because of copyright reasons, so all of the photos used in this video will just be taken in and around the area where the fire took place. At around 11 p.m. on Friday, August the 4th, 1933, a fire was discovered at R. Hood Haggies Rope Works in Willington Quay. It was discovered by a man called Mr. Frank Doyle who lived on Western Road, which was very close to the area where the fire took place. No details are given as to how he spotted it, so whether he noticed it from his own window or whether he was walking past is not actually known. But at this point it was still quite a small fire. He immediately notified the Wallsend Fire Brigade and they were very quickly on the scene. However, by now the fire was starting to spread from one shed to the next. But it would actually be several hours after this before the fire would reach its full height. The fire was later described as one of the largest to have happened on Tyneside for many years. Hundreds of bales of raw hemp were stored in the sheds which had somehow caught fire, and it was these that had caused the fire to be quite so fierce. Some of the bales, it was later stated, were amazingly unburnt, but they were entirely saturated with water, and it was said they could be seen bulging out of the gaps in the iron sheds where they had collapsed. The two buildings involved were said to be between 150 and 200 feet in length, and 60 feet wide and 60 feet high, and it was said that they were packed from almost floor to ceiling with the bales of hemp, which it was said were highly flammable. Superintendent F. Finley of the Wallsend Fire Brigade had been in charge of the operation to stop the fire from spreading to other close-by sheds and workshops, which contained more valuable machinery and material, and would have no doubt meant that Haggies would not have been able to operate at all if these had been lost. The operation to stop the spread, despite the fierceness of the fire, had been successful, and it seems that only some of the paintwork on the adjoining sheds had been damaged. Calls had been sent out to other local fire brigades, and Wallsend was soon joined by those from Newcastle and the River Tyne Police Fire Brigade. It must have been seen as being incredibly lucky that the tide was in on the gut at the time the fire first started. Otherwise, the fire float, as they were apparently called, would not have been able to get close enough to help. It had also been a fear that a change in the winds would have affected the nearby Willington Dean Viaduct, or as it is more commonly known these days, the Seven Arches, and this would have caused problems with the passing trains. Luckily, the night was very calm with almost no wind at all, which had also helped to stop the spread of the fire. There was no mention in any of the articles that I read that the trains passing over the Seven Arches were actually stopped, so no doubt those on the trains passing by would have had a very clear view of the fire. The fire was so fierce that despite the best efforts of the fire brigades, they made very little impression on the buildings involved. These were made of iron, as mentioned before, and the intense heat meant that they quickly bent out of shape, and the walls were said to be often glowing red. The roofs of the buildings collapsed one after the other and fell onto the fire, making the firemen's job even harder. And when the first roof collapsed, it was said that inside of the building was a raging inferno. And the heat was also so bad that it was impossible to get close to the fire, and many of the firemen had to strip to the waist to stop themselves from passing out with the heat. Now this is something I believe that would simply not happen today, as it would also put them at risk of being burnt. However, I do admit that there is no mention in any of the articles of any of the firemen at the time being hurt due to being burnt. However, Robert Snowden of Potter Street in Willington Quay, who was 45 years old, was one casualty of the fire, and he had been sent to the Newcastle Infirmary early on Saturday, August the 5th. Now, I'm not sure if this would have been the RVI as opposed to the infirmary at Forth Banks, as the RVI did replace that hospital in around 1906, but I couldn't quite confirm when the old Newcastle Infirmary actually closed, so if anybody does know any details of that, do please let me know. Robert had been suffering with concussion after being hit on the head by a piece of fallen wood. He was said to be recovering well from his ordeal and was not in any danger, but none of the articles actually stated how he come to be hit by the wood, so it's not clear if he had just been passing the fire or if he had been one of the firemen working to put out the blaze. At the height of the fire, the flames were said to be as high as 50 or 60 feet in the air and could be seen from quite some distance away. People from Willington Quay and other close-by areas were actually out in the streets watching the fire and watching the firemen at work. And it was even said that people from other areas were travelling to Willington Quay just to see the fire. It was said that hundreds of people were standing on the abutments of the Willington Dean Viaduct, where they were able to get a much better view of the fire, and others stood on the sloping banks above Willington Gut, where they were also able to get a very good view of the fire. And it was even said that many of those watching were actually dressed in their night clothes. So it seems that the idea of being well dressed before you went out was not quite so important when you were out watching a fire, and even the paper stated that many people could be seen in their pyjamas. I have to admit that I would not have been one of those out there watching, as the smoke was said to be quite dense, and no doubt did not smell very good and was probably not very healthy either. So I can't quite understand why anyone would have wanted to be outside breathing in the fumes just to be able to watch the blazing buildings. The damage to Haggies Rope Works was said to be over £80,000, which today would be a staggering £7 million. So it truly was a huge amount of damage, and although Haggies was said to be very busy with orders at the time, it was without a doubt a loss that they could have done without. Luckily, it was also said that many of the orders had already been sent out, and if this had not been the case, the loss would have been very much higher. The fire was still burning by the afternoon of August the 5th, and it was thought that it would still take quite some time before it was completely out, and this was the opinion of Chief Constable D. Atkinson of the River Tyne Police. The River Tyne Police fire float had only just been able to resume their operations on Saturday afternoon, as they had had to leave the gut several hours earlier due to the tide having gone out. And at this point in time, the gut had not been altered, so the water did come quite a lot closer in some areas to where the fire was. And the river fire float had, it was said, done a very good job while it had been close enough to reach the fire. One of the news reporters at the time said that they had been told the fire would be unlikely to cause any problems for those who worked at Haggies. Work, they thought, may be held up for a few days. However, the reporter had been told that as soon as more materials became available, the rope works would set their workers in what they called high pressure mode to hopefully be able to make up the losses caused by the fire. And the owners of Haggies had also told the reporter that they had been very lucky that the fire brigades had worked hard to stop the spread to the main works, which was something that would allow them to continue making ropes without too much of a problem. The cause of the fire, when reported in the papers over the weekend of the 5th of August, was said to be unknown, and unfortunately I did not find any further articles where a cause was mentioned. So if anyone out there listening to this knows any more about this story and knows the cause of the fire, then do please let me know. The fire did eventually burn out, and only the burnt and twisted metal remained where the sheds had once stood. And another reporter from one of the local newspapers visited Haggies just after the fire, and they were told that it was hopeful now that work could be back in full swing almost immediately, as there were sufficient materials left in storage to keep things running for a couple of days, and further supplies had already been ordered, and it was hoped that they would be delivered within the next couple of days as well. So this was actually a little better than they had initially thought, as there would be no hold-up in resuming work at the factory. And I'm sure that the workers would have been really pleased to know that their jobs were safe, despite the terrible fire that had taken place. I also imagine that many of the workers would have lived quite close to Haggies, so they would have seen the fire firsthand, and no doubt would have been worried that their jobs would have been affected. So it was actually good to know that Haggies was able to keep them all employed without any problems. And a fire at the rope works must have been something that the owners would have always been worried about, as the materials they used would have been highly flammable, so no doubt they would have been covered by a very extensive insurance, so that no matter what, they would have been able to keep their business open and protect their workers, or at the very least compensate their workers if they did have to close. I do hope that you have enjoyed this short little story about the Haggies fire of 1933, and I'm sorry that I did make quite a few mistakes. I don't know why, because on the short videos I tend to make less, but today I've made one or two, so I do apologise for that. I do hope that you have still found the story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.